Welcome, everyone. I'm just sort of waiting for people to sign on. We have one of the speakers is here. The other one is actually teaching right now, and he'll be here in a few minutes. So we're going to have to wait for him to get here before we get started. But as we're waiting, I wanted to remind you where you are. You're in the Program on Climate Change, Center for Health in the Global Environment. It's our 2021 seminar series, and with a focus on health and climate change. And this was the brainchild of Becky Alexander, who is on the call right now, and Jeremy Hess, who will be one of our first speakers, who thought that this was a good time to try to get together the climate science and environmental science communities with the people who are thinking about health and the impacts of climate change. So what we're going to do is we're going to have 2 speakers every week. And I think people have seen the schedule in a variety of venues. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. The organization today will be for, and we'll do this every week, we're going to have these 2 talks, 20 to 30-minute talks, and then by both Jeremy Hess and Kyle Armour. And then we'll open for questions from the general audience. And then after a few minutes of that, we'll excuse the general audience, and then we'll go on to have breakout rooms with the students who are enrolled in the class. So if you're enrolled in the class, please stay after the discussion, and we're going to put you into breakout rooms to come up with more questions or comments as a group so that you can get to know each other and that you'll be able to interact directly with the speakers. So, and then those of you who are enrolled in the class will also need to check the Canvas pages for reading and discussion assignments. And for 475 students, we will also be meeting on Thursday, where we'll be working in detail on you doing focused research projects on an area within climate change and health. So that's sort of the lay of the land. And as I've said to many people, one of the reasons we are able to do this seminar series this year is that there's a pandemic, so nobody is traveling. So it was possible to line up 20 excellent speakers for these 10 weeks of the quarter. And I'm super excited. This is just a rare opportunity to allow these conversations to happen. And I don't think they would have happened in any other year. So one small thing to celebrate, that we're all at home and willing and interested in engaging on these really important topics across the university. The other thing to notice is that all of the speakers are affiliated with the University of Washington. And this just highlights the wealth of expertise that we have in these topics across climate change, climate impacts, environmental science, health impacts, and climate justice and environmental justice issues. So I'm just super excited about this seminar. I don't want to spring this on you, but Becky, did you want to say anything as we're waiting for Jeremy to show up?
Yeah, I just thank you so much, Luann, for organizing this and putting the effort in. And I think that's a really good point that I hadn't explicitly thought of, that the pandemic has actually allowed us to put together the speaker series of 20 people, local people, not having to worry about travel. So thanks, Luann, for putting this together. And I'm also really excited to be able to have this opportunity to bring together these 2 different communities, and perhaps will result in some interesting collaborations in the future. Yeah.
So Kyle, I guess we're just kind of hanging in here. Anybody have any questions about the seminar series or the courses? You can ask them now. But I guess we'll just hang out for a few minutes until Jeremy's done with his other teaching.
Luann, are you waiting for me?
Okay, I just gave a quick introduction to the seminar series, and I was going to introduce you first. Maybe I'll introduce both you and Kyle. Oh shoot, I actually wrote this down. Your affiliations are kind of complicated, Jeremy. So I've actually known Jeremy ever since he got to UW. So, or actually even before then. And Jeremy is a professor of environmental and occupational health sciences, also a professor of global health and emergency medicine at the University of Washington. So he serves many roles, both in the community and at UW. He also serves as director of the Center for Health and Global Environmental Change. And as I said, both Becky and Jeremy, this was their brainchild. So it's in collaboration between Program on Climate Change and CHanGE, as well as my courses that I teach every year. And Dr. Hess has an MD and an MPH in global environmental health, and in residency trained and board certified in emergency medicine. And then Kyle Armour is our other speaker, and he's an associate professor of oceanography and atmospheric sciences with a PhD in physics. The other thing to say about both Jeremy and Kyle is that Jeremy is a lead author for Working Group 2 for this assessment report of the IPCC, and Kyle is lead author for Working Group 1 for the IPCC report. And for those, they may explain that, and if not, we'll answer those questions afterwards. And as I said, the structure here is that Jeremy will start with a 20 to 30 minute talk, then Kyle will take over, then we'll take questions from the general audience, then we'll excuse the general audience and go into a discussion between the speakers and the students after they do breakout rooms and come up with questions. So there's a number of moving targets, but we'll figure this out. So Jeremy, do you want to share your screen?
I do.
Get started. Are you able to share screen? I might have to enable you to do that.
I am not.
Okay. Okay, you should be able to share momentarily.
Okay. Okay, this is not what we're actually going to be talking about, Jon Snow and cholera. This is the talk that I just left. Why won't it let me get out? Sorry, hold on 1 second. I have to activate a different presentation.
Feel free to put questions in chat and I can gather them, or if you have any questions or issues during the talk. Okay, Jeremy, take it away.
All right, thank you for your patience with my technical ineptitude. So I'm going to give an overview of the IPCC and in the process talk a little bit about my experience with it and hopefully set the stage for what is pretty important context for a lot of this work. And so I want to briefly give you a very quick introduction to our center. I'm not sure what you already covered, Luann, so I hope it won't be redundant, but we're a new effort and we're reaching out and recruiting people. And so I want to let people know about what we're doing. And then I'll talk about the IPCC and the political context of what the IPCC is trying to do. And we'll talk about the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and then what the IPCC does, what its goals are, and the question of severe risk, which is actually something that will come up again and again and again over the course of the quarter. What are the severe risks in the systems that we're looking at, and how might climate change affect those risks and when? So first, very briefly, a bit about the Center for Health and the Global Environment. I'm the current director, but Dr. Chris Ebi was the founding director. I'm not sure if Chris is in the audience today. I know she's got a heavy teaching load this quarter and may not have had time today to be with us, but she started us up, and I've taken the baton. We're an umbrella organization. We have members who are faculty, staff, students, mostly within UW, but certainly outside UW as well. And we are a member organization of Earth Lab, so we're part of its focus on climate change. We're also strongly supported by the School of Public Health, and in particular, departments of environmental health and global health. And we are focused on climate change and its impacts on health. We focus on three main areas. We're trying to develop a strong applied research portfolio in climate and health for the university. So not just for people who are sort of closely identified with change, but everywhere in the university, we recognize this is an important concern and we want to support it. We also want to support education and training around climate and health. And some of that means engagement around the physical science aspect of climate change and connecting, because this is fundamentally interdisciplinary. And then some of it is very specific to health, public health, medicine, and impacts in those spheres. And lastly, we work with SIG and other groups to advance decision support around climate change impacts. And particularly that for us is around adaptation for health impacts, and then mitigation health co-benefits, which is a really clunky phrase, but basically the health benefits of trying to reduce the likelihood of dangerous climate change. We have monthly gatherings, we have quarterly large meetings and events. We're starting, COVID of course threw a wrench into all of this, but we're starting to roll out a lot of programming this year. We're looking forward to that and hoping you'll join us. And it costs nothing, it's very easy, low bar of entry. There's a link there to become a member, and I hope you will. So thank you. All right, so the IPCC, we've known for a really long time, hundreds of years in fact, that loading the atmosphere with carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases comes with some risks, but we really didn't start doing too much about or with that knowledge until the late 20th century. And in the late 70s was the first World's Climate Conference. And then in the 80s, the IPCC was formed. And it's a joint effort between the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environmental Program. And its focus is on assessing risks. It's kind of the scholarly academic arm of the overall effort. The UNFCCC was actually formed after the IPCC, but there's quite a bit of interplay between the two that is important for us to understand the context and the overall goal of risk management that these two organizations play into. So the UNFCCC was formed at the Rio Convention, 1992, and ultimately there were 195 parties that are parties to this convention, so countries that signed on. And the IPCC, even though it was founded first, is actually responsive to the framing of the UNFCCC. So it's the arm that provides the evidence that the UNFCCC called for in order to support a political process to try and manage risks related to climate change. So as I said, IPCC formed in 1988. The goal is to conduct assessments. So those assessments have to do with the state of knowledge of climate change, our understanding around vulnerabilities to climate change impacts, the consequences of those changes, and what the timing will be. And then flowing from that, to identify options to avoid, prepare for, and respond to these changes. And also, I would add, this is becoming more and more important, to think about how our responses to those changes actually affect other risks, because there are a lot of feedbacks as we move forward, both in mitigation and adaptation activities, and take major decisions around these things. There are some important new risks that emerge. And all the governments that sign on either to UNEP or WMO conventions are members of the IPCC, so it includes most countries of the world. there's some common misconceptions about the IPCC. One is that it conducts research. So scientists who work on IPCC assessments often are highly tuned in to the major themes and important questions of the day that go in, that are front of mind in these assessments. And so they conduct some research in response to those questions, but it is not IPCC sponsored research. The IPCC collects these scientists, supports their assessment activities, and then reports those back to the public and to governments through these comprehensive assessments. It provides statements that are policy relevant and policy neutral. And we try very hard and in fact are forced through the process, which I'll talk more about in a bit, to be policy neutral in our prescriptions. And anything that seems policy prescriptive is essentially stricken from and recast in the reports. And the whole process is governed substantially by governments and their review. It's not just in the framing, but it's also in the actual conduct of the assessments, and then in the evaluation and framing of the assessment reports. There are a lot of different viewpoints in the IPCC, but the reports try to give a pretty broad perspective on all of that and allow for difference of opinion and acknowledge that in some cases there's not consensus around some of these important issues. So this is the overall organizational chart for the IPCC. You can see, as I mentioned, WMO, UNEP are at the top, and then there are these three working groups. And the working group 1, which Kyle's a part of, is focused on the physical science basis. So looking at emissions and atmospheric, oceanic responses to these emissions and projecting impacts going forward. Working group 2, which is the group that I'm a part of and that Chris is a part of, and focuses on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. So looking at current impacts, looking at impacts that are projected into the future, thinking about what groups are particularly vulnerable to those impacts, and then how we might adapt and what the limits to adaptation might be. Working group 3 focuses on the opportunities to reduce the likelihood of dangerous climate change through mitigation. Then there's also the task force on greenhouse gas inventories, which supports mitigation efforts and commitments through the UNFCCC and conferences of parties. And under all of this are the authors, contributors, and reviewers, and there are thousands of them around the world that support all of this work on a completely voluntary basis. So the paper that I passed along for this session outlined a number of the challenges that have dogged this process from the beginning. It's really a singular experiment in human history. And of course, not everything is exactly as everyone would like it. One of the challenges that the IPCC has had is that there's a heavy representation from high income settings, and there's not as much representation from developing country scientists, even though that's where a lot of the impacts are going to be. So there have been a lot of efforts to address this over the years. There's also a pretty well documented bias toward physical science in the assessment reports. I think that has changed also over time. But of course, it's a problem that we need a lot of physical science insight into in order to think about from a social and adaptation perspective. And so the physical science has had primacy, particularly in the early years. There's always the question of how to preserve authority as a trusted and unbiased body. And that's going to be a challenge forevermore. The challenge, I think, has different flavors at different times, but it's always an issue. And then one of the challenges has been depoliticizing the IPCC work and shunting the political aspects of its activities into the UNFCCC and mechanisms that flow out of that. And we can talk some about that, but in my experience overall, I think it's actually not been an overly politicized process doing the assessments. It's really all about the science and what it says. And then lastly, well, this last point here overlaps with that there's a clear need for the IPCC to be as much as possible and unbiased and focused on the science and providing an assessment of the science and the options, and then let the policymakers make the decisions that are needed. And as you can see here, many assessments have been done and many decisions have been taken as a result. The IPCC produces every 6 to 7 years assessment reports, and we're currently in the 6th assessment report cycle. In between those assessment reports, they do special reports. These are on issues that member governments have identified as particularly important. So there's been recent reports on the cryosphere, on the impacts of 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. I first was involved with the IPCC on the SREX report, which is a report focused on extreme events and disasters. And that was the first event, or first IPCC report, where working groups 1 and 2 came together and worked very closely instead of in their silos, which was a formative experience for me and really exciting, but also kind of challenging. So you can see here, this process is started through these organizations at the top and the member states, and then there's a lot of technical support that happens, and each of these working groups carries out its agendas, delivers approved outlines and other things to authors, who then go and assess the literature and report back up the chain. And as I mentioned, review is really central to this process. So reports are scoped by member states, approved, and then throughout the whole process, there's an iterative series of very close review. And these, ironically, these reports are not considered peer-reviewed documents, but they, each chapter, I don't know, Kyle can speak about his, but our chapter, I think our chapter in the current 6th assessment report, our chapter is focused on health, the changing structure of communities, and well-being. So it's basically health, conflict, and migration. And we had tens of thousands of comments, and we have to go for 80 pages of text, and we have to go through and respond to each comment specifically and submit that response. And then the people who gave us the comments get to tell us whether that was adequate or not, and then we go through this process again. So, and then after all of this, and we settle on text, then it goes to the member governments again, who approve the summary policymakers, which you were assigned as readings, line by line through a multi-day process where they hash out the language and other things. And finally, it's all accepted and published. And as I mentioned, the SREX was the first report where working groups 1 and 2 kind of broke out of their silos and came together and did a lot of really interesting and innovative thinking about how climate change is impacting risks related to extreme events, how extreme events relate to extreme impacts, and what the options are for addressing these, particularly in the disaster risk reduction and disaster response communities, which are kind of a unique group of people who are focused mostly on disasters, not on other less significant or more mundane impacts in the sectors that they work in. And so it was really an exercise in connecting across a bunch of different disciplines and also learning a lot of new approaches to how to talk about these things and think about them. And in my experience, this was probably 15 years ago, but this was, the SRX was when we came up with the risk diagram that you'll see in a moment, the first time that that diagram had been brought into the IPCC process. And I think it was actually quite a seminal report in a lot of ways for the IPCC, even though it was a special report and not one of the assessments. As I mentioned, there's a multiple layers of review, and you can see there are 4 different drafts that happen. Chris worked on the special report on 1.5, and there were 42,000 comments for the entire report. The governments, as I mentioned, really bookend the process. They drive the requests, they solicit participation from their members, they support travel and other things, and then they review the process as it goes forward. And they make solicitations for reviewers and all the rest. We can talk more about this as we move forward, but I don't want to be redundant or take too long. So that outlines what the IPCC is. And then it's important also to talk about the UNFCCC, because the UNFCCC is the political arm that actually outlines the overall agenda and goal for the IPCC. So as I said, I signed on by 154 states, 1992, and has a number of important articles that lay the groundwork for what the IPCC and the UNFCCC are trying to do. And I apologize, these are a little text heavy, but tried to emphasize what's important here in red, which is that the goal of the UNFCCC is stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that is not dangerous. That's important. Then the question becomes, well, what is dangerous? And as I mentioned, there's this risk diagram that was debuted in the SREX. It's actually the chapter I was working on that developed it. And this is the conception of risk that has informed IPCC documents going forward. And you can see here that risk is a product of hazards, so the physical hazards and the probability of those hazards and their severity, the vulnerability of the population, and then the exposure of the population. Just because the hazard exists doesn't mean that vulnerable people are exposed to it. And then within those risks, there are certain risks that are unprecedented and emerging. And then there are certain risks that are key, that are really fundamental for human societies and the systems that we value. And so we need to better understand the risks to those threatened systems. So the UNFCCC has a number of different important considerations. One of them is around what are key vulnerabilities. So what aspects of a society or community or a system, so it could be an important socio-ecological system, which is a natural system that has some element of human management. What are the exposure factors for those systems, and how do climatic stressors affect those exposures? How important are these systems? We've got lots of different systems and they're of varying levels of value to us. Some of the value is relative to how much we are able to mobilize to protect these systems and what we can do to protect them. For instance, coral reefs are an early harbinger of climate change. We're seeing a lot of pretty devastating impacts from marine heat waves and from ocean acidification to a lesser degree. And we don't have a lot of options for protecting those systems. So they're both highly vulnerable and also highly exposed, and we are limited in our ability to address them. So you can see here some other factors that affect vulnerability and persistence of vulnerability in different populations and systems. All of these are laid out in the UNFCCC as important factors to consider in the IPCC process. In terms of thinking about key risks, this is a dialogue that's been going on ever since the UNFCCC started and since the assessment reports have been written. But at least in my experience, and I'm curious to hear about Kyle's, I think this dialogue is taking on increasing importance as we're starting to see more and more risks emerge, and we're starting to appreciate just how profound some of these impacts may be on systems that are of high value to us. So we're seeing that there's widespread probability that there are significant risks materializing already. Some of these are irreversible, and that, of course, factors into whether the risk is key. Some of the issues that you'll see play out in some of the diagrams that I'll show you in a minute have to do with not just probability, but also magnitude and persistence and severity of these risks over time, and the ultimate impact on societies and productive ecosystems upon which they rely. all of this feeds into a framework called the reasons for concern and a diagram that's called the burning embers. The reasons for concern are basically a very focused distillation of the things that we care most about as human society. So it includes risks to these different systems here, unique and threatened systems. So coral reefs would be one good example. Risks associated with extreme events and impacts, the distribution of impacts and how widespread they are, how substantial they are in aggregate globally, and then risks associated with major events that have to do with thresholds that are irreversible and typically catastrophic. And here we have a collection of these burning ember diagrams from the third assessment report on up to more recent special reports. And what you'll notice is that there's a risk transition that happens for a lot of these systems right around 2 degrees Celsius, between 1 and 2 degrees Celsius. And that's part of the reason in recent years there's been a lot of intense effort trying to better understand exactly when the risk transition takes place. Is it 1.5 degrees? Is it 2? And that it's very clear from the beginning, it's been clear that after 2 degrees, all of these barometers are in a danger zone. And as we've gone through, different assessment reports have used this same diagram, presented a little bit differently each time. And the other thing you'll note is that the risks have gotten a little more severe as we've moved forward, as we learn more. The place at which the risks start to transition is a little lower in terms of temperature, and the severity of the risk in terms of the depth of the purple at the top is getting worse. And again, here burning embers from the SREX and the fourth assessment report and the fifth, and I believe this is 1.5. So all of this feeds into a process for, so all of that is the risk assessment. And then the risk assessment feeds into the risk management at a policy level globally. So here you have some text from the UNFCCC outlining the responsibilities of different parties to the convention and their need to commit to minimize adverse effects both on their own economies, but also on the global economy, public health, and the quality of the environment. And there's a clear expectation in the UNFCCC that more developed countries, which clearly are responsible for more global emissions and have historical debt, that they have a responsibility to support developing countries in adaptation and in continued development and protecting them from these impacts going forward. So what you can see here, this is a timeline from the UNFCCC of all the different actions that have taken place. And so on the top, you have all the IPCC activities and reports, and there's some other important global assessments that have happened that are also mentioned. And then all on the bottom are all the different decisions that have taken place. And probably the most momentous in the last decade was the Paris Agreement and subsequent efforts. And there'll be a global stock take in 2023, updating our progress. So the Paris Agreement, let me see, I think I may have another slide here. Yeah. Was notable in that it includes long-term goals and identifies trends to track. It is important to identify early commitments and then come back and take an iterative approach to understanding the impacts of those commitments, how well we're moving toward the goals we've set, and then a very clear focus on extreme events, extreme impacts, and the most vulnerable, and some new calls for transparency and financing that were not present before. So it was really quite a landmark agreement and very important. And that is a quick and dirty summary of the IPCC and the UNFCCC. I can speak more to my specific experience on either the SREX or the AR6. I thought it was probably more important to provide all this background, but I'm happy to talk about my experience with some of the more specific stuff related to health and climate in each of those reports during the Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. So I think we'll go on to Kyle and save your questions for after Kyle is done. So I made you co-host, Kyle, so I think you can share your screen.
Yep, great. I have nothing to add. That was great. Okay, I'll add some things anyway. So that was a fantastic introduction, and I knew it would be. I knew you'd cover quite a bit about the history of the IPCC and its role. So I wanted to kind of share, I guess, some different viewpoints about kind of my personal experience, but also things about kind of how I read IPCC reports, the uncertainty quantification, things like that are a little bit different than the history. So we'll get there in a minute. But first of all, as Luann mentioned, I'm a professor here in Oceanography and Atmospheric Sciences. This is what I look like most days these days on Zoom. My research is on on climate feedbacks, climate sensitivity, the ocean's role in climate change, Arctic and Antarctic sea ice, and high latitude climate. So I'm really focused on the topics that are covered in Working Group 1, which are all the physical science. Most relevant for today's discussion, I'm a lead author on Chapter 7 of the Working Group 1 for AR6. So Chapter 7 is focused on Earth's energy budget, climate feedbacks, and climate sensitivity. I'm also an author on the Summary for Policymakers, the Technical Summary, and the AR6 Synthesis Report. And so these are additional documents that are going to be summarizing Working Group 1 or the entire report, including all working groups. And we're kind of actively working on these. So I have a lot more experience so far with our chapter than I do with these other reports, because these are kind of ongoing. So as Jeremy mentioned, just a brief history. In 1988, the IPCC was established by these organizations. The first report came out in 1990. The first assessment report, FAR, was published. Then the second assessment report in 1995, SAR. The third assessment report in 2001, TAR. The fourth assessment report in 2007, which would have been nice to call FAR again, but of course that was already taken, so that became AR4 for assessment report 4. AR5 was in 2013, and then this is the one we're working on now that should be coming out, at least the Working Group 1 should be coming out this summer, and then Working Groups 2 and 3, I believe, will be after that. So this is actively being worked on, and we're kind of in the middle of responding to reviewer comments and revising the final version that should be kind of approved by this summer. As Jeremy mentioned, there's also been some special reports in between these. So these are kind of the big assessment reports that kind of cover all of climate change, the impacts, the mitigation, the physical science. Along the way, there's been these special reports. So for instance, 2012 had the SRX report. 2018 had the special report on 1.5 degrees. So the differences between warming of 1.5 versus 2 degrees Celsius. So these, I think of the big reports as kind of covering all of climate change and its impacts, and the special reports to kind of really dig into a specific topic. And I don't know the full history of how the special report on 1.5 degrees came about, but my understanding was basically we, as a community, perceived a gap in the assessment, in the sense that Paris basically said 1.5 should be what we should be aiming for instead of 2. And the scientific community looked around and said, yeah, we have some results to support the differences between 1.5 and 2 degrees, but we didn't have a report that really came up with a synthesis and really did an assessment of those differences. And so it was requested that the IPCC produce such a report to kind of support the policy notions that people had. That's my understanding of how that kind of came about. And so they produced a document that really digs into the differences of warming at 1.5 versus 2, the impacts of that, how that could be achieved, what it would require in terms of emissions reductions, and so forth. So these are kind of the role of the special reports in between these larger reports. So the fifth assessment report had these 3 working groups, just like the 6th assessment does. So these were published in these years and months. So the first to be published each time is the Working Group 1, which is the physical science basis. After that comes the Working Group 2 and 3 reports, which are the impacts, adaptation, vulnerability, and mitigation of climate change, that really build from the physical science basis and then bring in a lot more science into the impacts and mitigation and so forth. These reports are each written, or I should say altogether, the 5th assessment report had something like 1,000 authors from all over the world. As Jeremy mentioned, there's a lot of effort to reach or have involvement from authors from every country, basically. So that's a huge goal of these reports, is to have buy-in from every nation, and to do so, scientists are invited from every nation to contribute. And of course, it isn't uniformly distributed, as Jeremy mentioned. There's definitely a bias toward developed nations that are wealthier. So one of the big challenges is actually getting input from everyone. So that's one way you can do it, is kind of have an author team. So this is just an example from our lead author meeting in Vancouver, British Columbia, in 2019, back when we could stand this close to people. We had this nice group photo. This is just working group 1, which is the group I'm part of, where we went to Vancouver and had a week of discussions about the science and how we'd shape our chapters and how we'd shape the overall working group 1 report. Here's my chapter in particular. This is chapter 7, led by Piers Forster and Trude Elvmo. Here are our leaders, and these are all the lead authors. So the lead authors are this group of folks that I'm included in, that are kind of taking the lead on writing the chapter. And in addition to this group, we have another 20 contributing authors who are folks we invited to contribute either data or figures or assessment to help us write these chapters. So altogether, I think our chapter has something like 30 authors on it. So one of the things that I didn't really know going in, but I kind of know a bit better now, and I'm quite happy about, is just how science-driven these reports are. They're really written by the scientists who are just volunteering their time. There's really no oversight from governments in the writing process, but there is a lot of review. So these reports, as Jeremy mentioned, get reviewed many times. I think we're on the 4th review process now of our chapter. Each time we get something like 4,000 comments on our chapter that we have to respond to. And those reviewers are experts, the general public. You can sign up yourself to be a reviewer on these reports. Government officials review these things, basically anyone who's interested. And then we have to respond to every single review comment in a way that that's thorough to give these reports legitimacy. So we really put a lot of effort into responding to these review comments. And so it's about as peer reviewed as you can get without actually being called peer reviewed. And then the summary for policymaker documents are meant to take and synthesize the information in these reports in a way that's more useful for policymakers. And these are the things that are actually approved line by governments. I think this is the only place through the writing process where governments actually come in and actually look at the writing and have a say in what you say. And this is something I haven't seen yet because it hasn't happened for our chapter or for our working group, but I hope to participate in this later this year. And then importantly, I'll say it again, but Jeremy said it already, which is these reports are intended to be policy relevant, but not prescriptive. I think that's really the strength of these, is they don't come down on what type of policies are correct. They're really just giving you a menu of what will happen, what we can do about things, what will be the impacts in a way that could help inform climate policy, but not actually prescribing anything. So I want to just give a couple examples quickly about how things have changed over time. So I think this is a nice example. If you look back in 1990, the first assessment report had this statement. They say, we're certain of the following. There's a greenhouse effect. The emissions from human activities are substantially increasing atmospheric concentrations of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. These increases will enhance the greenhouse effect, resulting in additional warming, and that the main greenhouse gas, water vapor, will increase in response to global warming and further enhance it. So that's a feedback on global warming. This is something that they're certain of because we kind of knew most of the science for 100 years before this time. So they use the word certain because this is really established science. We knew all of these things. Then they said, our judgment is that global mean temperatures increased by an amount about 0.5 degree in the last 100 years. Back in 1990, that's all it had increased by. And that size of the warming is broadly consistent with model projections, but it could also be due to natural variability. And so they were less sure about that, and they were sure to kind of caveat that. And then they also say other human factors could have offset things, so variability could have contributed to this warming. And they say here, the unequivocal detection of the enhanced greenhouse effect is probably not likely for another decade or more. So they were pretty cautious in their wording back then. So let's fast forward now, 20 years later, over 20 years later, we get to the 2013 fifth assessment report. So now we have a very different statement. We say that the warming of the climate system is unequivocal since the 1950s. Many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. The atmosphere and oceans have warmed, the snow has declined, sea level has risen, greenhouse gas concentrations have increased. And then they say the human influence on the climate system is clear, this is evident from the increasing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, positive radiative force and the things that are driving global warming, which are associated with those greenhouse gases. Observe warming and understanding of the climate system. And so I like this just to kind of show the evolution of the language in these reports. They went from something which is very cautious, saying our judgment is that this has happened, but we're not sure it's human caused. And then 20 years later, we had the science to back up a much stronger statement about the role of humans in climate change. And so this is going to be, I think, even stronger in AR6, or at least supporting the same kind of strength about human influence being clear and unequivocal warming. I also want to just quickly say something about how to read a report. So those statements have citations here to other chapters. So this is coming from the summary for policymakers, and then they have this long list of where these statements you can find support for these statements. So you can look at the summary for policymakers figures, or you can dig into the chapters and see what information supports a statement like this that says unequivocal warming. So for instance, you can take a look at summary for policymaker figure 3, which shows the evidence to support the fact that sea levels have increased and sea ice extent and snow cover has declined. And in that figure caption, you can find further pointers to the figures and the chapters that support these summary for policymaker figures. You can also take a look at chapter 2. So chapter 2 in this report was observations, atmosphere and surface. It says, take a look at chapter 2, section 2, you go to that, and that talks about greenhouse gases, which is supporting that increased concentration. And then you can go look at that chapter and start to see figures like this that show the rise in CO2, the annual cycle is that little black line as the Earth, the biosphere breathes in and out CO2 annually, but there's been an overall rise over time. And then it cites in the figure caption where you can find the information that went into that figure. And then you can also look up resources like the references that support the way they've done the analysis. You can also take a look at section 2. You can find paragraphs like this that basically talk about the rise in CO2 and how much it's increased in the last 20 years. So basically the flow of these reports is summary for policymakers, synthesizes things, links to the chapters. Within those chapters, you have the full support of those statements. And then within those statements, you actually have links to the fundamental resources, or literature, I should say. So for instance, here's a paper which documents this that's cited. So no original research is done, but it's really just a synthesis and an assessment of all the research that's available. And then I think the last thing I want to say about these reports is that there's a lot in here about uncertainty quantification. So for instance, you'll see statements expressed as a level of confidence, and then separately statements expressed as a likelihood. And so the difference between these is basically saying how confident are we about the validity of a finding, or how much evidence do we have for something. So you could say we have high confidence the Earth is warmed. And then you can also quantify probabilities when it's possible. So if you want to say it's virtually certain the Earth will warm by a certain amount, you can give a value that you can quantify. You can attach a likelihood that says with what probability we think something can happen. Then you can also attach a confidence level from very low to very high. And so we have high confidence the Earth is warmed, and it's virtually certain that it's warmed by some amount. They have tables like this that kind of break these down. So one of the things I was kind of surprised by is when you see things like this, it gives you a sense that things are very quantified. But a lot of what we do as authors is often trying to kind of qualitatively give a sense of how certain we are about things, or how confident we are about things. And so even though we give, for instance, 99 to 100% probability in something, that's a judgment call. That's a room of authors and reviewers who are assessing that, saying that we believe something is virtually certain with this probability. And then same thing for the quantification of how confident we are in things. If something has high agreement across lines of evidence and robust evidence that everything agrees, we might say that has high confidence. Whereas if something is medium, we then have to make a judgment call. Do we call that high or low confidence, or medium? So at the end of the day, I guess I think it's very useful to have this uncertainty language and confidence language, because it really gives us a sense of what we do and don't know. But keep in mind that these are people who are making these judgment calls in terms of how confident we are in things. And it really is a community assessment, and really it's about building consensus around this through the review process that I think gives me confidence at the end of the day, maybe even high confidence that what we say is about accurate. And then finally, the outline of the Working Group 1 timeline. This is what it looked like. We were supposed to, it's So first of all, we started back in 2016 with scoping for the chapters. We've been working on this now for several years. We were supposed to have an approval session and publication of our chapter in early 2021, but this was all delayed due to COVID, where we shifted all the fun in-person meetings to virtual meetings that have just been going on at all times of night, basically for the last year. That has really slowed things down. So now we're slated to have acceptance of our chapters and release of Working Group 1 in July 2021 at the earliest. And so I think this is the current outline. So we are, let's see, where are we here? We're somewhere around here. We have a literature acceptance cutoff at the end of this month. So after January 31st, that's when we say we're no longer looking at new literature. We're going to synthesize what we know and finalize our draft, and that should be approved and out by something like June or July at this point. So that's all I have. Hopefully that was slightly different than what Jeremy presented, because I knew he'd do a great job on the history. Jeremy, I want your slides for the next time I do this, but I'm happy to answer any questions about that or my personal experiences. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jeremy and Kyle. I wish we could give you a big round of applause. But super interesting. I was wondering if there are any questions from the general audience. Students too, if you want to ask a question, you can either raise your hand or you can put it into chat and I can let the speakers know what the questions are. Just pause a moment, see if there's any comments or questions. Is there one here? Lipa?
Yeah, hi, thank you for speaking, both of you. I had a question. So I see that the IPCC is not meant to give like policy advice to governments. So is there some kind of other central source for that that's kind of equivalent in scope?
So I'll take a stab at that, and then Kyle might have thoughts too. So what the IPCC aims to do is outline the range of options. So what we often, at least in the parts that I've been involved in, we will, inventory the health impacts, for instance, of a particular exposure, and then we'll outline what the adaptation options are, perhaps in theory, but usually in practice, what's been done. And then we'll talk about what is particularly effective, what doesn't seem to be effective. So at some level, there's some implication there that, some of these things clearly are going to be more effective and certainly more cost effective than others. But we won't say, Saudi Arabia should be doing X, Y, and Z in this time frame in order to protect its population's health. We just sort of, it's a little bit more of a generic set of options.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, but I will say one thing, which is I think advice may not be the right word, because I think it is advice to governments in the sense of there's a range of menu options that you can choose, some of which have different consequences than others. I think that is a form of advice, but it doesn't go so far as to say you must choose this option or another, because that's really up to governments, up to people, it's up to voters, it's up to each of us those are kind of ethical judgments as to what amount of risk are we willing to tolerate, or what ecosystems are we willing to see damaged to what degree. We can't answer that with our science. I think that's really up to us to make those judgments. And that's, I think, where IPCC stops and says, now we pass on this information to let people decide. And that's the kind of thing that comes out of Paris. 1.5 versus 2 degrees there's no pure science that says that there's a threshold, right? It's really a judgment call as to how much risk you want to tolerate. And that's up to us quite separately from the IPCC process. So I think that's the place that the report should really stop and transfer it. But yeah, great question though.
Becky, do you want to?
Yeah, Jeremy, you had mentioned that there was sort of a bias towards the physical sciences, but it's gotten better over time. And so I'm wondering, maybe you both could comment on this, is how the two working groups, Working Group 1 and 2, work together, and how they are currently working together or plan to work together for the upcoming report.
So the bias is one that I wouldn't say that I've noticed or felt really. It's more that it's reported in the literature, and I think it was probably more pronounced at the beginning of the process than it is currently, though I can't say for sure. But there clearly was, they've done analyses of where the citations in the assessment reports came from, and the vast majority were from the physical sciences initially, and it's become more balanced since then. My experience around work with Working Group 1, well, it was much more through the SREX than through the assessment reports, because the meetings we have with the assessment reports are not, they're by the working group. And so I think there's communication, and certainly at upper levels and among people who've been doing this for a long time. And I wish Chris were here, because she could, I'm sure, tell a lot of stories and give a lot of insight into this. I think people who've been at this for a long time and have connections with people across other working groups find ways to connect and have conversations that span the activity. So there's a lot of informal stuff. And then there's some, I don't know actually if there are other reports that have where two working groups have worked together simultaneously. Do you know, Kyle, if that has happened?
Well, I'm not sure. Maybe those special reports, right? The 1.5 degree report does everything at once. And so I don't know the process. I wasn't involved in that. That seemed like when you're focused more in on something like a very specific topic, like 1.5 versus 2 degrees of warming, you have a smaller author team. You can talk more across working groups in a way that I think is more seamless. I don't actually understand how this is going to work for AR6. I'm new to this, and I have a bias toward physical science personally, but I haven't yet seen that communication, that handoff between the working groups. I hope to see that as part of the synthesis report author team. I'm hoping to kind of see how that happens. That's part of the reason I wanted to do it, is just to learn more about that. But I think it's a major challenge. Every time I do see conversations happening between working group authors, the things they want to learn are quite different, actually. The working group 1 is mainly focused on very large scale things. And then at the end of the report, or end of that section of the report, that you get into regional changes. And that's really the thing that's most important, I think, for the impacts. But that is quite different than what most of the report is focused on, which is really global scale, large scale indicators and changes. So I think it's a major challenge, not just for the reports, but for our field. That scale, going from the things we really understand at the global scale down to the things that affect people, that's just a hard thing for all of us to work on, I think.
I will say that like in the SREX, we had people from Working Group 1, a few in our chapter, and then also there were some chapters that were mostly Working Group 1 people and vice versa. But we were together all the time, and we're able to, walk questions over to one another and be more responsive in bespoke analyses in certain cases and stuff like that. So it was a lot easier. What I've seen in AR6 is the technical support units, the TSUs, will come in and say like, okay, so we've got this innovation around a tool for projecting or for visualizing temperature impacts at certain points in time regionally from Working Group 1, and they'll tell us about it. But we don't really have anybody from Working Group 1 specifically coming and talking with us. It's mediated. And I've never been involved in one of the summary processes, so I don't know how that works either.
Okay, so I think what I'll do now, unless there's more questions, is excuse the general audience and ask the students who are enrolled in 475 and 586 to stay. And then after everyone's signed up, I will put you into breakout rooms for a short discussion. And then I'm going to ask Jeremy and Kyle to hang out for a little bit. Thank you for everyone. We had like 85 people at some point, or a lot of people on. Okay, I think that's probably good. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I think this is going to work. This is my first time, so you're my guinea pigs. I'm putting a link in chat, and that's a link to PowerPoint, a Google Doc slide. And it just has basically instructions that say, ask you to introduce yourselves, assign a recorder who's going to write down the questions, and a reporter who will report out at the end. And then I'm going to go for, let's see, what time is it? Let's say 8 minutes. And then you'll come back and we'll have about 10 minutes for questions. You start a little bit late. Does that all make sense to everyone? Yeah, okay. So let me see if I can figure this out. So there's 40 people here. I'll make 8 breakout rounds. And I believe you'll be able to share screens so you can look at the slides together. Okay. And let's see. I'll bring you back in 5 minutes, in like 8 minutes.
Luann, do you want me and Kyle to go to rooms 2 or no?
No, I don't. Can you go in and then leave?
It looks like I can just not do it. So that's what I'll do.
Okay.
All right, breakout rooms. Now we see who has fallen asleep at their computers.
Yeah, there's still a few students here. Hopefully they are going into rooms as we speak.
Yeah, Jeremy, that was a great, great introduction, great history. I didn't want to spend too much time on any of that stuff because I thought we'd be overlapping. So I tried to think of other angles I could come up with, but I'm glad you went first.
Well,
So
I bet it went.
Lysandra and Chris, do you want to join a breakout room? And Stefan? Okay, that's fine. You can hang out here. Like, I should set a timer. So are you guys glad that you've done it?
You first.
I will be glad that I have done it. Overall, yeah, it's been really good to meet people, and I have better science questions now than I did 2 years ago because of the process. But I don't know, the transition to all Zoom all the time for these. I don't know how your experience has been, Jeremy, but I loved it when we were meeting every 6 months in person and having wonderful conversations and working hard together and making progress. I had my head around what we were trying to do, and it made sense. I've had real trouble keeping up the last 9 months over Zoom. A lot of times we have meetings at like 4 a.m. and I just haven't been committed enough to make all of those. And I've just lost track a little bit of everything as soon as it transitioned to that. It's been hard, but overall I'm happy. It's been good.
Yeah.
Greg was glad he did it. I think it really connected him, and it really helped to make his science more relevant.
Yeah.
And impactful, I think. And just watching him do it, from the side.
Overall, I am unequivocally glad that I did the SREX. That was a really formative experience for me, and helped me understand so many things that I hadn't understood up to that point, and even hadn't even thought to think about actually. Like, it was really it was great. The AR6 has been less so for me. I'm still glad I'm doing it, and I think there'll still be really important questions that come out of the process for me. It's been less, my chapter has been less well organized than the SREX chapter was, and we've felt that as a group. Also, we're health, right? And so all of our authors have been basically activated to respond to COVID. So it has been, in addition to what you're talking about, Kyle, logistically, we've just essentially, like, we had one author from China who, just stopped anything. Like, COVID broke out and he was part of the Chinese CDC, and we haven't basically heard from him. And so we've had real capacity issues on our chapter. We had them to begin with, actually. I think because it used to be there were two chapters. There was human security and there was health, and they merged them for this report, and they didn't really adequately staff it, basically. And then it got worse with COVID. So it's been really hard. And the other piece of it, and it didn't really come out in the discussions, but one critique that has been levied at the IPCC is that it's fairly conservative science. I think the nature of the process leads to, a conservative perspective. And particularly among the impacts people, you're starting to get this sense of like, well, there's a lot of really terrible stuff happening already, and we don't necessarily have all the science to prove it, but at least I've felt sometimes I'm like, I'm not quite sure that I would do this again, because I'm not sure it's the right way to make the changes that need to happen. Like, I think it's interesting, the question of what's going to happen to the IPCC as we move into a adaptation space where, mitigation is going to be important, but no longer gonna really fix the problem, which I would argue we're already there, but when everybody realizes it, and I don't think the IPCC has reckoned with that, actually.
Yeah,
Well,
some
and
sense. Oh, go ahead.
Well, just what you said about the extremes, that more and more now, I think, we have to get better at talking about them, and because that's how people experience climate change.
Mm-hmm.
The 1 degree C doesn't seem very scary, but having weeks where you can't go outside because of wildfires is pretty darn awful. So how do we, and yet the attribution question for those is controversial. So but it's clear that that's what matters to people, is the extremes, at least to me.
Yeah, this comes back to that disconnect I was talking about, right? I perceive it as a very difficult handoff between working group 1 versus 2 because of that exact issue. The things people care about, and the things that matter, and not just what we care about, the things that actually matter for us are less well understood, I think, than the things that matter less. And that's not just IPCC. That's the challenge of our field right now, I think. And it's motivating. We got to work on these things, but yeah. And
yet there's still these fundamental questions that haven't been answered, like what is the climate sensitivity of our planet, right? Yeah. So, and yet we know some things about, I don't know. Yeah, it's hard.
I mean, one thing I struggle with is the fact that the kind of questions I'm passionate about answering, like what's the climate sensitivity? That's a cool question scientifically, but policy-wise, like, okay, it could make a difference if it's really high or really low, but it's in the middle probably with some uncertainty. And I would like to narrow that more, but we're way ahead of the policy in terms of our understanding. So I don't really know that IPCC is that influential in terms of policy right now, because the policy is so far behind our understanding. So I think that's another thing we're going to have to reckon with, is we can keep doing these reports every 10 years, but like another 2 rounds of this, if we still haven't made big policy changes, like what are we learning in that sense, except about mitigation and adaptation? And so maybe adaptation is the frontier in that sense. Maybe there's more to learn there, but that feels less like an IPCC thing and more like we need to just start adjusting on the fly thing.
Totally.
I don't know.
Would you do it again?
Jeremy?
I would think long and hard about it, I'll be honest. There's a huge opportunity cost to doing it. There's a lot that comes out of it, and I really have learned a lot, and I do think you get great connections, and it spurs, you're forced to look at the literature across a whole range of spaces that you may not normally look at, and all that's great, but it's really hard to do that. And when I did it the first time, I had some of my time covered by CDC, and they allowed me to use that to cover some of my IPCC stuff. And here I don't have that. So it's changed my perspective of just how hard this is to do if you're not, a government employee. And you see a lot of people who do it who are government employees, and they have that space. And
okay, I'm going to close the rooms, but I want to hear your answer, Kyle.
Is this being recorded still? I have no answer.
They're going to close in a minute.
I don't want to be. I don't want to be
You know what,
committed.
ask Greg, and he says no. I wouldn't do it again. But he's glad he did it. I know he's glad he did it.
Yeah, I have to think about it as well. It's been I love my chapter team. It's been a really fun process getting to know people and getting to work with the scientists who are on my chapter. That's been great. I don't know. I'd have to think about whether I'd do it again. He said it definitely takes away from time that you have to do your own research or go hiking, all those things. We were just talking about whether we would do it again, IPCC.
Yeah, we were talking about their experience, but you're welcome to ask them about that again. So the slides were mostly for organizing you. I'll say that you're going to see some messages about moderating the sessions going forward. If you're signed up for 586, I'd love to have a couple of moderators, and I will send a message to everyone to sign up for at least one of the seminar spots so that you can do the introductions and that you can moderate the questions like I've done today. I hope that will be of interest to you. But let's get to the questions. We don't have a huge amount of time, and an hour and 20-minute class is not that long. So anyone want to volunteer with the questions you came up with? Or I can call on the specific groups if you want. I'll go in order of groups.
I can start. I mean, we're group one anyways, but my name's Emily. I think most of our questions kind of centered around the experience of collaborating on something at such a large scale. So what your experience is like as an author collaborating with dozens of other authors. Some of the master's students were talking about how it's already cumbersome sometimes with a few people. So just speaking to that experience, and also how you deal with such a large volume of comments and replies to the actual work and how you respond to things like that.
Okay, I can make you jump in here. In terms of collaboration, I think it's really great that we have so many diverse voices on our chapters. The fact that we have people from a bunch of different countries with a bunch of different backgrounds, it really makes the science better. And when you have a statement that everyone agrees on, you actually trust it a lot more. So I think overall it's a great thing. But there are major challenges. So time zones, I mentioned, that's one thing. Right? Working across time zones is hard, but also just cultural differences and differences of opinion from different nations. Different countries have different priorities, and that's part of the reason why it's so important to have a diverse set of authors, but it also makes it really challenging, right? I have a particular understanding of a scientific topic, and my co-author says, no, I think it's something quite different. And it's frustrating. And you have to and at the end, you have to come to consensus, and it makes it a better statement after the fact, after you do come to that consensus. But man, yeah, it's challenging to get 12 people to agree on any sentence, and then to have 4,000 review comments and having to respond to those. My method of responding is just to wait until the very last minute when I'm forced to do it, and then just devote like an entire week to basically going through all my review comments, and that's the only way I can force myself to do it. But I try to do a good job, and I try to take them very seriously, but it's hard. It's a lot of and the comments range from true experts, people who are like, oh, this is the person I look up to in the field, to someone you've never heard of who's just a member of the public who says, I don't think it works this way, and you have to say, this is why it works this way, or so it's a wide range of comments you have to address.
And I'll just add that we, perhaps different than some of the collaborations you may do in grad school, like at least in the chapters that I've worked on, everybody has their section that they do, and it's not like you're working with somebody closely on each individual section. And so that makes it a little easier because you just are doing your thing, and then you synthesize it, and then that's where some of the collaboration happens. But I find I also have a lot of newfound respect for colleagues who have to do this in English when it's not their first language. The whole thing is mostly carried out in English, though if you have a couple French speakers in a room, then they may transition to French. But for the most part, it's all done in English. And I shudder to think what it would be like to try and do this in a different language for me. So hats off. Like, but that's part of the problem too, right? That the whole thing is done. It's a little hegemonic in that sense.
You know what? We're kind of out of time, and I need to talk to the 586 students about what they need to do for the class. So I'm trying to think about next time. I probably will allow more time for discussion with the co-authors because I know there's more questions. But I'm going to say goodbye to Jeremy and Kyle now. And thank you very much for being the kickoff ones. And Jeremy, now that I have it organized, thank you for your brainchild. I think it's going to be really great. So thank you.
I'm sorry, I probably spoke too long. I often do.
No, it's okay. I mean, it's all great. I think, it's a work in progress, as everything is during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So you guys can stay on or go off, and I'm sure I'll talk to you both soon.
Great. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to take this opportunity to leave. Goodbye. See you.
Bye, guys. Talk to you later. Okay. So for people who are in 475, you can, we're going to meet on Thursday with the other link on the Canvas site. And, that's a graded course. You're going to do a bunch of writing assignments, and we'll talk in detail about what that looks like. For people in so you're welcome to sign off now because I'm going to talk to the 586 students. So basically, it's a 2-credit, no-credit course. All the assignments are up. The assignments are discussion boards on the readings. And I found that basically you post and you respond to a post on each of the readings. You don't have to fill out all of them. I can't remember what I ended up on, 7 of 10 or something like that. For the 586 students, they're due sort of before the next seminar, so you can reflect on the seminar and reflect on the readings. But they're open all the way to the end of the quarter, because I know lives are complicated and I don't want to be opening and shutting, and you're all graduate students and grown-ups, so you can take care of how you want to participate. So I anticipate everyone will get credit. I'd also like people to moderate the every week. So there's a discussion board there. And the other thing that they did for the communication seminar is to have a land acknowledgement. So I'm going to put out a message to everyone to collaborate on building a land acknowledgement that one of the moderators can present at the beginning of the seminar. So I will give you what they had from the fall seminar, the communication seminar, and we can go with that. Or if people want to change it, particularly since we're talking about climate change, it might be worth considering that in the context of the land acknowledgement. So that's the structure of the class. Are there any questions? I mean, I think it's all except for the land acknowledgement. I haven't put that on Canvas yet, but I think everything's on Canvas. As I said, you can do all the readings now and do the discussion board now if you want to. Question?
I have a question about the Google Docs that you put up for moderating. So you have a column that's introduce speakers, land acknowledgement, and moderator 3. Is the moderator 3, is that what you mean by like managing questions and whatnot?
Or just another person that would help doing it.
Okay, so we should just put our name in one of those 3.
Yeah, I mean, there's 29 graduate students enrolled, and there are 9 seminars. So that's only 18 spots, which is why I put a moderator 3 who could help, because otherwise everyone who wanted to do it would not have a chance, but I want to fill the first 2 spots first. Okay, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions, comments? Yeah, Lipa.
So there's no requirement to be a moderator. It's just an option.
There's no requirement. You have to do an extra discussion board, post, it's a choice of whether you want to do that or not.
And you choose the speaker if you're a moderator?
Yeah, so you can go into the Google Doc and just put your name down of what you want to do. Okay.
Thank you.
But once again, if nobody wants to do it and people want to just concentrate on doing the reading, that's fine with me. I'm happy to do the introduction and the moderator. I just wanted to give you a little bit more opportunity to engage with the speakers, because I know this is rough being online. I'm also welcome to take comments on any of the structure. Rosalind is here. I kind of stole some stuff from you. for organizing who has organized a reading group in oceanography. So I appreciate that. Any other questions or comments? I think it's going to be a great series. I'm excited.
Yeah, quick question. Is the only way we're being graded the discussion boards that are on the Canvas?
Yeah, or if you moderate, I'll give you
Okay,
points
perfect.
for moderating. I mean, as I said, I always give people, I mean, and it's credit, no credit. So
Okay, perfect.
for
Thank
the
you.
586, and I don't anticipate that anyone will not get graded. And the discussion boards are really quite something. They're very thoughtful. So I think you'll enjoy participating in the discussion boards. Okay, I think we're over. So feel free to.
Sorry, really quickly. Will you be posting the seminars on Canvas in case we can't attend, or?
So I did record this. What should I do? What do you think? You guys want it to be posted? What do you think?
That's
yes?
fine.
No?
Nothing
Yeah.
like that to me.
Yeah, I kind of messed up organizing the Zoom link. So it's, but I'm going to try. Okay. And what I'm probably going to do is just post it as it is, and you'll hear all the conversation between the speakers and everything. And if you want to watch it, you'll just have to fast forward through that stuff. I didn't ask these speakers if I meant to ask them and I forgot. So I will confirm that they're okay with it being recorded, and then I'll figure out how to post it. I should have recorded to the cloud, which is not what I did. So that was a mistake. Okay, any other questions? Okay, we'll see you next week, and do reach out if you have any questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much.